Welcome to UI5ers Live, the webcast where we bring you what's new from the OpenUI5 and SAP UI5 world. I'm Margot Wolny and this is episode 59. Enterprise apps are increasingly dealing with localization-based data. Think of logistics, asset management, or operational monitoring. And the MDC GeoMap control brings map visualization into the metadata-driven UI world. And who better to walk us through it than the developer who built it, and this is Biser Miloshev. Hi, Biser.
Hi.
We also look at the experimental debug tools that were recently shipped. They were shipped with OpenUI5 1.149. UI5 object right in your browser console for inspecting controls, modules, and framework internals. Hot off the press and worth knowing about. And Thorsten Hochreuter is our go-to expert on this one and will show us what's there. So hi, Thorsten.
Hi.
And Stefan Beck, Peter Müßig, and Andreas Kunz are here for the discussion as well. And we'd love your questions and thoughts. Just drop them in the chat as we go. And I think with this, I can hand over to the real experts here and start with Biser.
Hi, community. Happy to be here today, having the opportunity to share some more details about how you can bring geospatial data in UI5 applications. This is now achievable with the newest control in the MDC library, which is MDC GeoMap, and it's designed for displaying interactive maps, visualizing GeoJSON data, integrating vector and raster tiles from various providers, enabling features like clustering and selection or handling user interaction. At the very beginning, I would like to share some insights with the following slides, and then I'll go for a demo with some coding samples. That's the agenda for today, so let's go to the key capabilities. We support different controls like panning and zooming the map, tilting, object selections, clusterizing, and drag and drop. As features, we have support for a variety of features like spots, polygons, lines, geocircles and circles, and also we have arcs. As I already mentioned, we support displaying vector and raster tiles. Regarding the providers, MDC GeoMap is not tightly coupled to a specific map provider. We offer support for the following ones, for example, Esri, here, TomTom, and we also have integration with HANA Spatial Services. As map provider is something that we do not offer, consumers are responsible for obtaining and managing provider access and covering the costs with their API keys. Please also have in mind that the map have purely rendering purposes, and it's not related to data persistence, formattings, and providing some tiles. Now let's go to the usage part. Here you can see on this diagram the layers and how we actually did it. At the beginning, GeoMap was something that we implemented as web component, but then Peter, that is here today with us, came with the UI5 tooling, and we also have it in sap-ui-5. At the end, this translates to the manifest by simply the need of having dependencies to the sap-ui MDC and sap-ui GeoMap. Please have in mind that this requires obtaining SAP developer's license agreement, but I guess you already know that. Now let's go to the interesting part with the Delegate. MDC control, MDC GeoMap is part, as I already mentioned, of the MDC library, and we follow the concept of the library providing delegation of the protocol part to the consumer, so the control can be model agnostic. Its core responsibilities are to provide fetching of the metadata, property metadata, defining the binding strategy, and the creation of the dynamic control content. And I guess it's now time for a demo, freestyle UI5 application with CAP. And here you can see that we have some filters, map, that is actually the MDC GeoMap control, and a table below. It's something like list report. And the map actually visualizes randomly generated store locations for specific coordinates. If I use some of the spots, for example, if I click on this one, I see some additional details for the location, and also have options that are something like business case related. But if we try, for example, this one and click on the show routes, what we will see is that we now have visualized the routings for the outgoing and incoming transfers. For the demo purposes, I've achieved that using open source geolocation provider, but in case you have one, don't worry, it's covered. What else can we have here? Not only visualizing spots, but as I already mentioned, we have polygons. And if I, for example, press here from the context menu, regions, you can see a Choropet map with agenda and with a legend explaining the density of the stores per country. With stores, choosing a region shows the number of the stores. What means polygon for the map? It's following the GeoJSON standard, and here you can see the feature with type and coordinates. Let's quickly check for a polygon. For example, this one. Yeah, okay. You have a set of coordinates starting with the first node or the edge, and in the edge is the very same. The rest are the other edges of the figure. Let's go back to the application. I mentioned the table, and what I wanted to use it for is to showcasing a case when you can use a table and selecting an entry there. By using the map, you can fly in and quickly view the location you've chosen. What else we have? Maybe we can show creating of a store here by using map click with the coordinates that we propagate as an event. We simply can fill in a form with the latitude and the longitude of the selected location instead of driving the user to fill them manually. And I think as use cases, that was most of it. Now let's go for some coding. Here you can see in my XML view the decoration of the MDC GeoMap control with its properties. For example, we have the default center latitude and longitude, the default zoom, some control configurations if they are enabled or not, and the most important part, the delegate with its name and the payload with collection for the entity set, and the configurations that can be used lately in the delegate to configure, for example, here the spots. If I change those values here and go back to the map, yeah, you see that the spots are now smaller. Going to the delegate part, what we have here, as I mentioned, we are using as internal control the sap.ui-GeoMap And then what we need to do is just fetch the metadata. In our case for today, we have JSON that is resolved with keys and the data types. The other interesting part is initialization, where we actually construct the inner map from creating it with property infos that are already available. Here you can see how we configure the provider, and actually for the demo session today I'm using OpenStreetMaps as open provider, but if I change it to something that I have as Esri demo developer token and demo service, we can easily see that, yeah, the map now gets... Okay. Come on, it's not fetching the task. Yeah, now we use Esri as our map provider here, and showing this I will tilt the map to explain something more about the controls. In the top left corner we have panning and tilting, and also zoom in and zoom out controls for the map. At the left bottom corner we have the scale control. Here you can see some copyright control that is required for every map, and of course we have selection, already providing a couple of options for selection mode. For example, I'll use some of them. Let's see, a rectangle, and if I select a region on the map, it tells me what actually are the coordinates of the selected area, and I can then easily, using the API of the map, export the locations of the stores in that area. Good. Let's go back to the coding. What we have also here is how we bind the item segregation. It's list segregation, and let's say we have entries with different geometry features, like I said, spots, lines, or polygons. In the factory, we can actually obtain the type of the figure. In our today's session, we have only spots, and this is how we construct the spot. Here with longitude and the latitude, providing some colors that actually came from the Delegate payload info, and also a touch on the click, allowing us to open the popover with the additional data. Am I missing something? Maybe I can show also the GeoJSON and how it looks like. Here is the description of the regions that are shown on a Coropet map. We just have types of the features, then some property that is necessary for displaying the info for that area, and then the required geometry with its type, polygon. And here actually are the coordinates according to the standard that I've shown. Maybe one last thing that I can share is actually in our controller, the table case with the flying, we simply use the context to get the latitude and the longitude, and then tell the map fly to with that as zoom and transition. And as you already saw, the transition happens pretty smooth. I think that's for my part. As next steps, we are already working on some enhancements and new map controls, so stay tuned and happy geocoding.
What a ride.
So I see no questions in the chat so far, or if there are questions for you guys, then drop it to the chat, then we can also address that.
Yeah, maybe a question from my side. I forgot to mention at the beginning that this control is still experimental, no? So I think it was introduced with 142.
42, yeah, exactly. 42, and yeah. Any feedback is warmly appreciated.
So in general, you feel comfortable with this control, but still waiting for feedback so you can really ensure that everything is stable. So that's the reason for experimental, or are there still some open requirements where you figure out things or so?
More or less, we are waiting for a consumption and feedback. As requirements, I said we are working on some new features. So
good. Yeah, I think currently people are still thinking of questions or what you showed and consuming it. So, but in general, as you heard, the team is really looking for your use cases and your feedback. So feel free to check this control out and share your thoughts and feedback with us.
Before we continue, I'd really like to add one thing, because I think this is really also essential. Biser mentioned that in between, yeah. So this is really built as a web components first, this GeoMap control. Mm-hmm. And we used our UI5 tooling modules to do the retrofit of that components back as UI5 controls and make with that also the usage possible. So it's one of our things where we really also keep to our strategy that if we build kind of new controls, we build them as web components, and we integrate them back into UI5 and make them usable that way. And they feel really natural. So for most of you who have used web components in combination with UI5, you also may have felt this, that it's really easy to use them. And that's the way forward. And there was a question now. Is it possible to have more than one data source on the MDC map? E.g. having...
Yeah, actually it's possible. You can have multiple sources for the map, and using different layers for each source, you can visualize them all.
Then it's up to you to play with that if you are interested, and if something's missing, then let us know and we can provide also more information, right?
Yeah.
I think we can go over to the second topic, and with this to Thorsten and the debug tools.
Thanks, Margot. Then let me share my screen so we can directly dive in. All right. So I'd like to share something to you about our new debug tools, which is surprising because you could have thought that we would have something like this a while ago, but we didn't. So with version 149, as you can see here in the demo kit, we have a new set of debug tools. I'm going to walk you through what we offer here, also later on how you can extend it, and I'll give you, of course, a short demo how that looks like. So when you look at the demo kit, you go to documentation, and let's start here, and I show you where to find the relevant information. If you search for debug, you can already see there's a new entry called as experimental debug tools, but there's also some little bit of information on the top level here. So when you start with debugging, you will directly find at the very top that these are still experimental debug tools. Reason for that is, of course, they're meant to be used and experimented with from, well, not only internally, but also externally. So if you find issues or you think you have a good idea how we can extend this, or maybe you do not like a certain way how the API behaves, then, well, please give us feedback. You can open the issue on GitHub and we will look at this and hopefully refine this API. So before we look into how all of this works, I think the first starting point is the activation. So there are mainly two ways how you can activate the debug tools. One is by the classic sap-ui-debug switch, which of course loads the debug sources. That means the non-minified sources, and it also activates the new debug tools. But occasionally, or rather often, you will probably also want to debug in minified sources, or you have bundles built for your application, custom bundles specifically. And then you can use a new switch that is called sap-ui-debug-tools, and you can set it to true, and then it will only activate the debug tools, but not the debug sources. That can be helpful so that you have a little bit more tooling to work with, even when you're working with minified sources. One of the reasons why we introduced the debug tools right now is also because on the main branch, we have gotten rid of a lot of deprecated API, and we especially have gotten rid of the globals that were exposed through different namespaces. So right now, if you go to the main branch and you serve your application there, you cannot use globals anymore to reach all the little utility functions that you used before. And now with this new tool suite, we introduced them in a more official way that is consistent and that also keeps stable between the current master branch and then of course the main branch. So right now we're running on the regular deployment here. It's 149, and before we look into more stuff down here, if you scroll down, you can see documentation about this. But let's have a look at this. Look in the debugger. So when you open the debugger for your browser, you will now see that I already set debug tools true in the URL here. This is a URL parameter, of course. And then you can see this little new entry here. When you open your browser console, it tells you essentially where you should start with using these tools. Type UI5.help, and let's just do this.
We don't see the debug tools right now. We only see the browser.
Oh, that's interesting. Then let me see if I can share those too.
While you're doing this, just a hint. So main branch stands for the legacy free version of UI5, and master branch is the traditional UI5 1. something we are all using.
So now you should also see the URL parameter here that I activated. It says sap-ui-debug-tools true. Tools are activated, and on the right side in the debugger, you can now see this little new message that says UI5 debug tools experimental, of course, and then type UI5.help to get a little bit of a help. And when we do this, let me expand the console here, you get a bigger log like with any other CLI tool. So it's not a real command line as in a shell, but it's a console in a browser, and it behaves similarly. So when you open the help command, you will see all the tools that are right now available. And you can also see there's a differentiation between basic tools and library-specific tools. Right now, in this version of UI5, we only have library-specific tools for the SAP UI core library. In the future, all other libraries can contribute to this and add their tools into this UI5 namespace that is available only after you activated the debug tools. And then the basic tools, they are always available, and they are just all-purpose utilities that essentially anyone can use for debugging. By the way, when I say debugging, of course, you shouldn't use that productively. I hope that is very clear. So this is not a productive API, so only use this for analyzing issues. Another reason why we have this help command here and why we decided on the CLI approach instead of providing yet another graphical user interface is that these tools on this CLI can be easily used by AIs. So if you use the Chrome MCP tools or any other remote control of your browser through an LLM or a coding agent, they can easily just call the help command, look at all the commands available, and then use those for a bit more efficient debugging instead of trying to calculate an XPath to retrieve a DOM element or something like this, which AIs typically do during debugging. So if you look at the very top here, those are the basic tools. I give you a rough idea what you can do, but we're not going to look into every single tool here because that would take too much time. One of the interesting, or probably the most interesting things for us are these two things here. So when we analyze, for example, customer incidents, typically you start out by looking at the device API. So this is a shorthand for what you normally also get if you require the SAP UI device API. It's now exposed as a shorthand here. You can see this is actually this module content, and then you can look at all the things that you need. What's the operating system? Is it a touch system? Is it a combi device, etc.? What browser are you on? What's the version, etc.? This is typically very helpful to analyze issues. Another shorthand that we introduced here is the config, which is a shorthand for our configuration facades. So right now you have the control behavior, the formatting, localization, and the security facade. And then you have all kinds of different things here. For example, on the localization, you can change the language of the UI, and then you get events, etc. So this is, again, just a shorthand if you want to debug something like figuring out why a translation text is missing or something like this. And then the other two things that are most commonly used are by ID and control. Right now, you can do this via jQuery. There's a little bit of a plugin that we have where you can fetch from a DOM element the corresponding control instance. But with this shorthand API, you can see it's using $0 here. You can go to the Elements tab, try to find any UI element, or you pick something like, let's say, the icon up here. You can see that there's some form of flex item. I don't know what exactly that is. But if you go down to your console, UI5 control, and you do $0, it will, let me type this correctly, that would be helpful. Not control, but control. Yeah, you get the control instance in the command line that corresponds to the specific DOM element that you picked. In this case, apparently it was an HBox, as you can see by the ID generated. If you look for something else, that maybe here's a toolbar. So if you do this, well, then you get the toolbar control. So these are the very low-level basic things. And then when we look at the library-specific tools, which we internally so by the way, I'm from the core team, so we use the core library tools quite often. They're really helpful for debugging issues that have something in relation to the views, right? What views are instantiated, what is the owner component, what components in general are instantiated. So for example, if you do things like UI5 core components, you see that this is our component registry, where if you say all, you see that in this case, there's only one component running, which is the SDK itself. If you do this in a more complex application or with a Fiori launchpad around, you will see all kinds of components. And then from here, you can use your basic debugger tools, making a right click on the object, and then saying, hey, I want to export this to a global variable, and then you can do all kinds of stuff on those objects. Additionally, we have a couple of tools that support debugging routing. You can attach to routing events. You can figure out what is the router for a specific component or a control. You can find the owner component. And then there is another shorthand. It's UI5 core modules. Those are just helpful tools that we internally use. So those are shorthand references to in our team, most commonly used modules. That means the XML view, our XML processor, the core itself, the component class, and so on. Now, as you can see, these are library-specific tools. The goal is that all libraries have a way to contribute their own tools depending on what they need to do to this tool suite, and then it will all live under the UI5 handle on top level, but is then, as you can see in my commands that I executed earlier, grouped by the respective library. In this case, we own and maintain the core library, so everything we added is under the core suffix, and then in the future you might have UI5.m or .fl if the flexibility or RTA colleagues want to add something like debugging tools for, I don't know, their flexibility change handlers and so on and so forth. But how do you do this? So let me close the debugger and have another look at documentation. If you scroll down a little bit here, there's also a bigger section about contributing library-specific tools. It explains what you as a library developer need to do if you want to add your debug tools into this whole facade, and then it's automatically loaded when your library is loaded, and it's automatically activated once you set the sap-ui-debug-tool switch under the extension section. So in the init of your library, you go to the extension section, you set this, and then we automatically, once the debug tools or the debug mode is activated, we load a specific file, and that file has a convention. The convention is that it's named debug-tools.js. That is the precise name of the module, and it has to live in the support/debug folder of your library path. So you take the path of your library, you create a support, you create a debug folder, and then you create a debug-tools.js file. There's a reason for that convention. It has to do with bundling and already existing exclusions by the tooling. But in general, if you put your file there, it will automatically be discovered. You don't need to configure anything else except this switch in your library.js and the init of your library. And then here's a short condensed snippet of how it looks internally. So what do you have to implement to get your tools in here? It's actually very simple. You have to return an object from your UI5 or from a debug-tools.js file. It has an __ help object that will be deleted at runtime. So the debug tools, they take this away, but the content will be rendered in the UI5 help. Reason therefore is we do not want to pollute this namespace too much. So the help is automatically extracted, but by convention, it has to start with 2 underscores. And here, this is just a basic key value mapping from a string that is the command that you want to explain, and then an explanation text. That is very bare bones. And then down here, you have your library namespace. In this case, it's mylib. And then you can put whatever you need in there. And of course, you should only put stuff in there that you want to document, or the other way around. So make sure that this is consistent, and then it's automatically discovered. It's automatically injected into the UI5 facade under this object namespace. And then for convenience, we introduced a little scope API that you can get from this UI5 debug helper utility. This does nothing more than create an empty object for you without a prototype chain. And that is important because if you want to iterate over that object, or if you want to visualize the help dialog, you don't want to pick up native API that is inherited through the prototype chain. So if you want to get rid of those, just use the scope API and then put your object in here, and then you're clean. And whatever you write in your object will end up in the debug tools, will be visible. That's also explained here again how that works. Yeah, and then there's a little bit more explanation about things that go into a bit more detail. I don't think we should look too much into this, but there's a spy API, for example, that allows you to spy certain functions. You can get the call count, etc. This is modeled along the sign-on API. So if you use QUnit or sign-on for writing your unit test like we do, it's essentially the same API. It allows you to give it a context object, a function name, and then a subscriber, and you can from that spy retrieve information. So I can also show you how that looks like before I close my part, or if you have questions, I'll answer them then. So if you look into our core facade here, under the section, where is it? I don't see it. Is it under views? No. Oh, no, sorry. Up here it is. Yeah. So this is the spy API. You give it a context object, you give it a function, and then the call back that you will execute. So for example, if you could do something like, let's say, the managed object. If you have that reference, or this is your object, you give it a API name like, I don't know, like some setter API, whatever, and then you add your callback API here. And every time the set or whatever API it is you want to spy is called, and your callback will be executed, and the spy API returns an object. And then you can use things like call count or get calls and essentially look at this like you would look at anything that you can do in QUnit. This is especially helpful if you do this initially. Set a breakpoint, register your spy, and then you let the application run, and then you can look at all the calls that have happened, and you can analyze if they are expected or not. So this is basically the idea behind this. Yeah, and in the future, there will probably be a bit more basic tools, depending on also, of course, your feedback. If you have something that you think would be helpful or something that is missing, these are the most basic things that we need. But there's probably some stuff that might go into the basic tools. And then, of course, every library, hopefully in the future, will contribute other parts that are helpful for the library itself or for others. Like the core part is probably also very interesting for other library developers outside of the core library. Yeah, so this is essentially it. So this is available since 149. It's documented here. There's also another subpage that kind of replicates the topic a little bit, but goes into a little bit more detail at the bottom. And that is it.
Thank you, Thorsten. When looking into this thing you presented there about the namespaces or these scopes where you can put this custom function from the libraries into, it is not really the name of the library which is reflected here. It's just, let's say, one thing you decide for. I think there was also written that you should be careful at the end what you decide for.
I didn't explain this explicitly. So by convention, you should use your library name, but in general, you can use any sub namespace you want. But you have to be careful of name clashes. So
because you have only a last segment from the library name, you could then easily run in clashes if there would be libraries with the same name running there as a duplicate. But is there also nesting possible of the namespace, or is no? This I think not. It's not intended or to have a kind of a nesting.
It's not intended. I mean, you can nest these objects, right? And then you have that nesting, but the one that is automatically injected will only be the top level object. But if you look at the stuff that we have in the core, it behaves like this. So you have something like ui5.core.views. And then some other API in a deeper thing. But of course, views is not a library in itself. So the first
but somehow you have to
the library name.
But somehow you have to reserve on the root a name which is unique for your library.
Yeah. And technically, of course, if you use core, you will override core tools in the worst case. So you should probably be a bit careful what you choose here. But
Okay.
I mean,
I think as there are no big questions on the line, we have 6 minutes to go, and there are no topics, we can also close it up, or?
Thanks a lot, Thorsten and Biser, for walking us through your topics. So that's really great and highly appreciated. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. But I would also say for now we can close and see you next time then, So thanks for watching.
Yeah. See you next time. Thanks so much. Ciao, ciao.
Bye. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.